Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 8, Retribution, Part 2. It was still dark, very dark. Trevor, Beck, and Seth each had their sights locked onto a very undesirable obstacle. The retired capital of Esmeraldas, now the stronghold of the Beltran Leyva cartel. As they studied the backside of the compound, now run by the infamous chancellor formerly known as Lazar, and his cartel mercenaries, Seth noticed 3 men standing in the parking lot. The parking lot was vacant, other than trash piling up, and of course the vehicle they'd spotted earlier now, sitting mostly in their line of sight, obstructing a better view. It sat in front of a fence, which surrounded the compound's back entrance, but was dwarfed by the Spanish structure, which stood 3 stories high, with ledges on each level. This time, however, unlike their initial breach of the cartel fortress, there were no guards posted on the upper levels. Instead, in the center of the parking lot, stood 3 men around a bonfire, constructed from a metallic cylinder barrel. "Is that who I think it is?" He looked closer at the 3 men. The fire projected red and yellow dancing lights across their faces and bodies. 2 men stood facing away from their view, while one of them stood facing toward them, opposite the 2 others. The 3 strangers formed a circle around the fire. Here and there, the man's face would come into view. And here and there, Seth's growing rage became more intense as he quickly identified the man's silver handlebar mustache. Kent, that fucking bastard. I'm gonna make that motherfucker pay. Trevor looked at Seth. We have to get out of here. We can make it to the beach easily from here. You'll have time for your revenge later. Beck nudged her brother. And then what? We'd just be stuck on an open beach, waiting for them to find us. We can swim? He said in a weakening voice, knowing how stupid his words were, but unable to take them back, as they were already out on full display. Beck gave her little brother a look that only an older sister could give, forcing him to retreat into an obedient younger sibling, awaiting her next command. No, this is our best option. It's why I brought you guys here. We did it before. We can do it again, she said. Before, we had weapons, radios, supplies. We have nothing this time. Beck rolled her eyes. Didn't you even read my letter? I have a plan. Suddenly realizing that they had just been recently rescued by her, then blindly followed her to a key escape location. It dawned on him that perhaps he should just follow her lead. Okay, so what's the plan? Beck looked back at the parking lot. See that Jeep? He noticed the Jeep sitting right outside the fence, on their side of it. Right on the other side of the fence, the Jeep was sitting next to was a dumpster about 50 feet from Kent and his two men. Beck continued explaining her strategy. It's gotta have some weapons in it. Look at them, they're completely unarmed. We make it to that Jeep, get inside without attracting their attention. Whatever is theirs becomes ours. We'll hold the advantage. Trevor looked to his sister. Yeah, but once we make a sound with any guns, we find it's over in seconds. I'm sure there's many more of his friends just inside. Beck agreed with a nod. That's why we can't let it come to that. We have to obtain any weapons in that vehicle, and then sneak up on them without making a sound. Once we have them cornered with their own guns, we all know they'll agree to assist our departure. After all, they're just mercenaries, right? She then looked over to Seth. Once we have them subdued, you can have your deserved revenge. It was music to Seth's ears. I'm on board. Trevor rolled his eyes. Christ, you guys are fucking nuts. He nervously smiled while shaking his head in disbelief at the prospect of moving forward with the idea. Despite his doubts, it was him that broke their formation. All right, he said with a sigh. Let's go. He continued to confirm his alignment to the agenda as he began to crawl on his belly, beginning the long journey down the short, darkened, grassy hill. The three were now on the flat ground that followed the slight drop as they all in unison shimmied their way across the small, dark field toward the Jeep. Trevor was in front, Beck behind him, and finally Seth. Suddenly, without warning, they heard a loud slam of a door off into the now much closer parking lot. Trevor waved his hand back at them, keeping it low and by his side, signaling the two followers to stop. They looked on as they noticed the three in the parking lot had become two. Kent was now facing away from them, staring at who they now recognized as Ash. Ash opened the door and followed the other one into the building. They could only assume was Samel, the third of the Three Stooges. Trevor and his two teammates stayed extremely still as they watched the development unfold. Their hearts raced as their throats became dry with a desperate wave of anxiety. They watched as Kent turned around and started slowly walking across the parking lot, smoking a cigarette. He walked past the bonfire, raging from within its metal home, and stopped about halfway to the fence. He looked up into the night sky and paused as he took one last puff of his cigarette and flicked it far in front of him, almost reaching the fence line. Then, he turned and faced the bonfire, approached it, and placed both his hands in front of it, absorbing the heat for warmth. Now it was only Kent, and he was facing away from the three. Trevor waved his hand again, in the same exact manner as before, only this time in the opposite direction, signaling the two to proceed towards the Jeep. After what felt like a lifetime of sheer anxiety, the three of them finally made their way to the vehicle. They each got up in a squatting position and huddled next to the car, hiding out of view of Kent's sight. Beck signaled to the two of them to the door of the Jeep. Trevor peered around the car and focused his view on Kent, while holding a fist directed behind him at the two, telling them to hold tight. Once he saw Kent, still occupied with warming himself, unaware of the events taking place behind him, he broke his fist into a gesture that suggested moving forward with the Jeep. Seth stood most of the way up. Beck still crouched to his side, and ever so gently took the door handle into his hands and slightly lifted it. A very soft, muted click sounded, letting Seth know it was unlocked and ready to be opened. He slowly and cautiously opened the door and leaned in. Trevor was still watching Kent for any hint he might turn around and blow their cover. Beck, still crouched by Seth's ankles, had no idea what either were currently observing in their individual efforts. Seth, leaning into the vehicle, reached across the seats and on the floors for anything that might feel like a weapon. Nothing, at least nothing on the front seats. He didn't want to open the back door, as the front was traumatizing enough. He also didn't want to give up. He put his hand between the front driver's seat and the door frame and stretched his arm through and began feeling the back seat floors. Eureka! He felt an assault rifle. He grabbed it, feeling by memory the best place to hold it for making the least sound, or God forbid, firing the thing off. Very carefully, and as quietly as possible, he slowly retracted the weapon from the back seat to the open air. Beck made a motion with both her hands, suggesting he give her the weapon. He placed the gun in her hands, and she began to inspect it for ammo and functionality as quietly as she could. Seth, meanwhile, leaned back into the car to hopefully luck upon another useful item. After searching for a moment, he was unfortunate and came up short. He looked down at Beck and shrugged. Her eyes lit up as she pointed to the vehicle's open door interior. He turned and looked down at what she was pointing at, and there, in the pocket of the door, sat a large, serrated knife. He threw a wide-eyed stare and a smile right back at her. He grabbed the knife and quietly closed the door without latching it, not wanting to draw unnecessary attention their way. He crouched back down and thought to himself, "It would have been better to have found another gun." He continued to contemplate in his head. This will have to work. Spending too much time on this assignment may blow their cover. If they wanted to be successful, they would have to move swiftly. There's already one man to confront now, possibly two with the potential return of Kent's cronies. Who knows who'll be joining the reunion if too much more time were to pass. Get while the getting's good. Seth finally tapped Trevor on his back, letting him know mission accomplished. Trevor shifted back on his feet, staying crouched, then tucked himself back out of sight and turned to the two. He looked at the weapons they held and nodded with content. Then he signaled for them to double back, the opposite way around the vehicle, toward its back bumper. The three, having turned their positions, now gained a new leader, Beck. She peered around the bumper to view Kent's activities. He still stood there, his back facing them with his hands to the fire. He was warming them up, losing himself in the flames as he was wondering what was taking Ash and Samel so long. He withdrew his hands and reached into his pockets and pulled out a pack of smokes and a match in either hand. He struck the match across the cold asphalt and began to light up another smoke, oblivious to the three behind him, darting into sight and then out of sight as they prepared to scale the fence that stood between the truck and the dumpster. His cigarette was fully lit now as he took a long first puff, when suddenly the door swung open, but it wasn't Ash and Samel. A young white male appeared, blonde hair, blue eyes, and tan skin. He wore a finely trimmed beard and sported camouflage pants and a white sleeveless shirt. He was of a more slender tone than Kent, but just as tall. He carried with him a rifle, slung to his backside, and approached Kent without a word, forcing Trevor, Seth, and Beck to momentarily halt their advance, each laying as flat as possible on the darkened ground behind the dumpster and still beyond the fence. As the newly added dilemma approached Kent, They finally exchanged words. "Horatio," Kent said loudly at the approaching man, cueing him to respond in kind. "Hey, you guys heading out?" Their conversation became lowered in volume as Horatio closed the distance between the two, making their exchange discernible for the three stalkers. It was a quick conversation as the pair promptly exchanged a tight embrace, not leaving out a few manly pats on one another's backs as if they were saying goodbye. With that, the new arrival quickly turned and walked back to the door he had emerged from, eventually opening it and disappearing into the Capitol's back entrance. Kent was alone again, taking another large puff of his cigar, while three blurry, dark silhouettes beyond him silently ascended the fence, falling behind the trash compactor one by one. As he stood there smoking, the figures emerged and slowly came into focus as they became closer to his backside. Suddenly, he dropped his smoke and raised his hands in forfeit as Seth slid a knife across his throat. Beck, now confident, walked in front of him with a condescending smirk. Trevor walked around his other side and joined Beck as she pointed the assault rifle at Kent. Kent looked at the two while holding his hands up and listened as Trevor used his own words against him. "You know, Kent, one should never fall asleep on guard duty. Or, smoke a cigarette while completely unarmed in the middle of a fucking parking lot." Kent stared back at the two and gave his best chuckle while his Adam's apple lay tightly under Seth's blade. "There's no way out of here. You guys are so fucking dead." Beck chimed in on cue. "You see, that's where you're wrong, old buddy." "The three of us?" she said as she eyed her two companions. "We've got nothing to lose. You took our family away, carved massive holes in our legs, and left us in the middle of a fucking cartel fortress. You, on the other hand, well, that's a whole nother story, isn't it? You've got quite a lot to lose, and I think your friend there might start with that pretty little throat of yours. So, if you don't do exactly what we say when we say it, we're gonna turn your insides out and force them down your fucking throat." She gave him a flirty little smile and a wink to sum up her proposal. Kent took a hearty gulp. Just then, they heard the door behind them swing open, accompanied by laughter. Beck and Trevor swung around as Beck pointed her gun towards the threat. Ash and Samel stopped dead in their tracks. They each dropped the cans they were eating out of and the spoons they were eating them with, and raised their hands. Trevor looked at the pair, caught off their guards, and signaled for them to join Kent. "We've been waiting for you guys. Why don't you join your friend, Kent, over there? Get warm by the fire." The pair cautiously moved over near Kent, their hands over their heads, attempting not to escalate things any further. "Trevor, check them out," Beck ordered. Trevor walked up to them and began going through all their pockets. Not much was found, chewing tobacco, cigarettes, matches, and whatnot. Then Trevor happily sounded off. "Look what we have here." He dangled a pair of keys in front of Kent's face, which he had just removed from his pockets. They were the keys to the nearby Jeep. "Tell me where the kids are," Beck said in a much lower and more deliberate voice. Kent laughed, making Samel and Ash uneasy. They didn't want to die tonight over Kent's hubris. Beck continued on. Seth slid the knife deeper into Kent's throat as blood began to drip from the serrated edges. "Okay," Kent said in immediate response to the fatal threat. "They're safe. They're in a town 9 miles southwest of here. Vuelta Larga. The Russians swap the kids from town to town. They call it crossbreeding. And Anne," she sternly requested. Seth kept digging the knife deeper into Kent's throat, giving him some encouragement to answer his interrogator's line of questioning. Kent, under duress, frantically continued. "At the Esmeralda airport, probably in one of the hangars. They turned them into some kind of medieval hospitals. They force feed hostages there, intravenously. They call it a feedlot. They have a lot of them. The Russians' clients are sickos. Nobody knows what they're up to, but they are very well equipped. That's why the Russians work for them. They were very prepared when shit went sideways across the globe. They supply the entire program here and everywhere. In return, the Russians are supplied, as well as the cartels. But they're fucking diabolical. Any cartel anywhere pale in comparison to the Russians' clients' agendas. It's like they're herding and raising humans as fucking cattle. What do you mean, cattle? Beck questioned. With that, Kent just rolled his eyes and repeated the certainty he felt would be the three's fate. What the fuck does it matter? As soon as you leave here, they will find you. And when they do, they will kill you, he said, causing Beck to nod at Seth as he obliged by piercing Kent's neck once more with his blade. Now, with his shirt slowly being drenched in his own blood, Kent quickly answered her question, achieving a reprieve from the knife's edge as Seth loosened his grip, allowing their hostage to speak clearly. That's why they feed and house you fuckers. It's why they give you clean toilet paper. They want their cattle to be more pure or some shit. They've got an endless supply chain of goods to take care of their product and to pay their mercenaries. How do you think these motherfuckers all around us have plenty of ammo and guns after all these years? How about that cigarette I just smoked? We're not the ones you guys should be angry with. It's these fucking clients that the Russians have. You see, we're just like you. We're in this shit show too. He then chuckled and looked at Beck and Trevor with an antagonistic grin. We're just smarter than you and much higher on the food chain, he said as Seth clamped down harder on his throat with the blade of his knife, causing Kent to grit his teeth and shut his eyes as he let out a slight grunt. Beck smiled. Was that so hard? She looked at Seth and nodded. Seth eased off the knife slightly, but kept it firmly on his throat. Then Beck looked at the keys in Trevor's hands. Well, Kent, I'm sorry. I know this is anticlimactic, but we just really must be going. And as we learned our lessons, you most graciously taught us we just can't afford to leave any loose ends. Ash and Samel looked at their boss, then back at each other, their hearts beginning to race as Beck's ominous tone echoed in their ears. It was a beautiful sunrise over the sandy beaches of Esmeralda. The jungles swayed with the wind as they performed their ritual morning ballet of fluttering leaves. A beautiful capital basked in the early dawn, gowned in its Spanish colonial-style architecture. Just within its walls, a large bedroom suite dominated the layout of the top floor. Just then, there was a loud knock at the beautiful interior doors, separating the bedroom from the halls. The doors burst open. It was Santiago and Nicholas, generals of the Beltran Leyva cartel.
Senor, please, you must come with us,
exclaimed Nicholas. The back doors to the Capitol, leading to the vacant parking lot, flew open. The Chancellor walked out with a fast pace, still arranging his sports coat and tie. His brothers followed closely behind him. He squinted his eyes, shielding them from the sunlight. He peered off into the distance as a look of anger spread across his face. He gazed upon the site at the top of a grassy hill just outside the fence. There, among the trees, hung three men, Kent, Ash, and Samel. Kent was hanging in the middle, his abdomen sliced open, his bowels spilling out, covering the grassy earth below.